On the night of July 18, 1969, a car drove off a bridge into the water. Inside the car, a woman was trapped. The man who escaped was Joan Kennedy's husband, but he did not call the police immediately. He waited 10 hours, and during that time, there was one person who had no idea what was happening. That was Joan, the wife who was pregnant, lying alone, believing that her marriage was still intact. From that moment, everything began to collapse. Reputation, trust, and her own life. So what really happened in this marriage? Why did a woman who entered the most powerful family in America have to live in silence, endure, and gradually lose herself? And how did that night change Joan Kennedy's life? The answer begins in Bronxville, New York, in a house where image mattered more than emotion, and a girl was taught to always smile, even when she was breaking inside. Her father, Harry Wiggin Bennett Jr., was a successful advertising executive on Madison Avenue. Her mother, Virginia Jones Stead, had once been a famous model and always taught Joan that a woman must remain calm and perfect in every situation. In the Bennett household, emotions were not expressed outwardly, but had to be strictly controlled. From a very young age, Joan learned how to turn herself into a perfect image. She began modeling early, appearing in Revlon advertisements on The Perry Como Show and in Coca-Cola commercials with Eddie Fisher. But her true passion was music. The piano keys were the only place where Joan did not have to perform, a private world her parents could not control. She studied at Manhattanville College, a Catholic school for upper-class girls, where they were taught how to become perfect wives for the elite. Joan graduated in 1958 with a bachelor's degree in English and music. The turning point in Joan's life happened on an October afternoon in 1957 at the inauguration of the gymnasium at Manhattanville College. The ceremony was held to honor Kathleen Kennedy, the sister who had died in a plane crash from the Kennedy family. It was there that Jean Kennedy Smith introduced Joan to her brother, Ted Kennedy. At that time, Ted was 25 years old, a law student at the University of Virginia, possessing strong charisma and carrying the renowned Kennedy name. Ted pursued Joan with determination, like an assault that a 21-year-old girl had never experienced before. Joan's family fully supported the relationship. To them, the Kennedy name was not just a name, but a ticket into the most powerful elite circle in America. However, reality was not as romantic as it appeared. As the wedding plans were rushed forward, Joan began to feel anxious because she realized she did not truly understand the man she was about to marry. She even expressed hesitation, but Joe Kennedy Sr., Ted's father, immediately shut it down. To him, this wedding was a strategic move in the family's political plan, and it had to proceed on schedule. On November 29, 1958, the wedding of Joan and Ted Kennedy was held at St. Joseph's Church in Bronxville with 500 guests, including some of the most powerful figures in politics and business. Just weeks earlier, Ted's brother, John F. Kennedy, had won a decisive victory in his Senate re-election, making the atmosphere of the wedding even more vibrant. After the ceremony, the couple went on a delayed honeymoon in Acapulco, Mexico in June 1959, after Ted graduated. But from the very first days, Joan began to feel the difference. Ted was often distracted by social connections instead of spending time with his wife. The glamour of the wedding quickly faded. Joan realized she had stepped into the life of the Kennedy family, a family with its own strict rules. At the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport, everything operated under the rigid rules of Joe Kennedy Sr. Here, strength was the most important thing, while weakness was not allowed to exist. Joan was forced to take part in rough football games on the lawn, where if you fell, you had to get up immediately without complaining. She had to learn how to sail in harsh weather conditions simply because Joe Sr. believed it was a way to build willpower. In the Kennedy family, women were not equal partners, but supporters. Joan's role was clear. She had to always be beautiful, remain silent, and support her husband unconditionally in public. She had to face strong-willed sisters-in-law like Ethel Kennedy and Eunice Kennedy Shriver, who were already familiar with this highly competitive lifestyle. Joan, with her gentle and shy nature, often felt pushed to the sidelines during intense political debates at the dinner table. The real difficulty began to show when Joan discovered that Ted was a womanizer. His affairs were not a secret among the elite, but the Kennedy family culture required Joan to accept and remain silent. She was taught that a Kennedy man's infidelity was not a family scandal, but a private burden that the wife had to carry herself to protect the family's image. In the early 1960s, when John F. Kennedy became president, the pressure on Joan increased dramatically. She became an important political promotional tool. At campaign events, Joan often performed piano to attract voters. Her music created an emotional connection that no political speech could achieve, helping Ted win the Massachusetts Senate seat in 1962. But behind those successful performances was a woman who was beginning to feel that she was gradually losing her personal identity. She had to wear carefully selected outfits, smile according to a script, and stand at the exact distance calculated by media experts. Joan had officially become part of the Kennedy family, a place where the spotlight was brilliant. But the price to pay was her own freedom and self-respect. In 1964, when Senator Ted Kennedy was lying immobilized in bed after a serious plane crash, Joan Kennedy, the young wife, stepped out alone to campaign on behalf of her husband to hold the Senate seat. That was the image that marked the beginning of a difficult period, but also showed her resilience and strength. Joan was not just a wife standing behind her husband. She was the mother of 3 children: Kara, born in 1960, Ted Jr., born in 1961, and Patrick, born in 1967. But few people knew that to have those 3 children, Joan had endured the pain of 3 miscarriages and 1 premature birth in the mid-1960s. When Ted was seriously injured with 3 fractured vertebrae, a punctured lung, and multiple broken ribs after the crash of an Aero Commander 680 aircraft, Joan did not collapse. She spent hours at her husband's bedside, caring for him while also taking care of their 2 young children, then only 3 and 4 years old. And at the same time, she was pregnant with their 3rd child. She traveled across the state of Massachusetts, speaking at campaign events, shaking hands with thousands of voters, and helped her husband win with more than 70% of the vote. In 1973, another major challenge came when their eldest son, Ted Jr., was diagnosed with bone cancer at the age of 12 and had to have part of his right leg amputated. Once again, Joan was by her child's side throughout the painful treatment and recovery, helping him overcome his insecurity so that he could later become a lawyer. However, all those efforts could not prepare Joan for that night in July 1969. On the night of July 18th, Ted Kennedy left a party with Mary Jo Kopechne, a 28-year-old political aide, in an Oldsmobile Delmont 88. The car lost control and went off Dyke Bridge into Pocha Pond. Ted escaped, but Mary Jo was trapped and died inside. What caused the greatest outrage was that Ted did not call for help immediately. He waited 10 hours before reporting it to the police. At that time, Joan was pregnant with her 4th child and had to remain on strict bed rest as ordered by her doctor at their home on Squaw Island after 2 previous miscarriages. Despite her fragile health and emotional collapse upon learning about the accident and the unknown woman in her husband's car, Joan still appeared at Mary Jo Kopechne's funeral just a few days later to preserve her husband's image. She wore black and stood silently beside Ted Kennedy in court as he pleaded guilty to leaving the scene of the accident. The pressure from public opinion and the pain of betrayal were too much for her body to bear. Only a few weeks after the Chappaquiddick incident, she suffered her 4th miscarriage. This was the final shock that pushed her into complete despair. From those repeated losses and the breakdown of trust, alcohol gradually became the way Joan used to forget the loneliness inside the luxurious residence. In reality, Joan's alcoholism had its roots in her family. Both her father and mother were quiet alcoholics within the upper class. In the Kennedy family, where weakness was not allowed, Joan found neither understanding nor help. Ted Kennedy was often absent because of political work and extramarital affairs, leaving Joan alone in the house in McLean, Virginia, with the household staff. To hide the smell of alcohol from her children and others in the house, Joan resorted to methods such as drinking vanilla extract used for baking or mouthwash, because they contained high alcohol content but were easier to conceal. Her alcoholism was no longer a secret when she was repeatedly arrested for driving under the influence in 1974 in Virginia, then again in the late 1980s, and especially 3 times in 1991 alone. There were times when police found her drinking vodka directly from the bottle in her car on a Boston highway. Her stays in rehabilitation at McLean Hospital or St. Luke's Roosevelt were only brief pauses before she fell back into the cycle of drinking to forget the pain that she had never been allowed to express. Joan Kennedy had endured and carried so much for the Kennedy family, but the price she paid was herself. In the late 1970s, the Kennedy family once again prepared for a new pursuit: the seat of the President of the United States. Although at this point the marriage between Ted and Joan Kennedy had truly broken down, and they had been living separately since 1978, in front of the public, they still had to maintain a united image for political purposes. Joan, despite undergoing psychological treatment and struggling with alcoholism, made a decision that shocked both the political world and her own family. She agreed to participate in the 1980 campaign. But instead of remaining silent and smiling as she had for decades, Joan chose to confront her problem directly in the media. In a striking interview with People magazine, she openly admitted that she was an alcoholic. She described alcohol as the way she coped with misfortune and the overwhelming social pressure of being part of the Kennedy family. This act was not only a personal confession, but also a blow to the Kennedy family's traditional culture of secrecy, where weakness had always been considered unacceptable. While Ted Kennedy struggled to answer the simple question from journalist Roger Mudd about why he wanted to become president, Joan stood out on the campaign trail with rare honesty and courage. She traveled across the country, shook hands with voters, delivered powerful speeches, and shared her journey of recovery at Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. Although Ted's campaign failed against Jimmy Carter, for Joan, this was the first time she truly lived as herself in front of millions of Americans. When the lights of the campaign stage finally went out, Joan Kennedy realized that she no longer had any reason to continue playing the role of a political wife in a script that had become outdated. In 1981, the couple officially announced their plan to divorce, and all procedures were completed in 1982 at the Barnstable Court in Massachusetts. In the divorce settlement, Joan received a large financial compensation of $4 to $5 million, along with ownership of the house on Squaw Island, a property that had belonged to her family before she met Ted. At the age of 45, for the first time, Joan Kennedy held the key to her own place as she moved into a high-end condominium in the Beacon Hill area of Boston. This was not just a change of residence, but the beginning of a journey to rediscover the identity that had been buried for 24 years. She returned to her most original love, classical music. Joan enrolled in a master's program at Lesley University in Cambridge and took her studies seriously, away from the cameras. In 1982, she earned a master's degree in music education, an achievement based entirely on her own effort rather than the Kennedy name. Joan began to appear on major stages, not as a political figure, but as a true pianist. She performed with the Philadelphia Orchestra and the Boston Pops Orchestra, receiving long-standing ovations and positive professional reviews. She even narrated Peter and the Wolf by Sergei Prokofiev, turning her public performance skills into a tool for arts education. In 1992, she published the book The Joy of Classical Music, a guide for you and your family, an effort to bring classical music closer to children and families. She spent time teaching music to children and participating in mental health charities, using her own past experiences with alcoholism to help other women facing similar struggles. After so many years living in the shadow of the Kennedy family, Joan Kennedy finally found her own path. She returned to music, wrote books, taught children, and helped other women who were struggling with alcohol. However, the battle with old habits was never easy. In the 1990s and early 2000s, Joan fell back into a painful cycle of brief periods of sobriety, followed by severe relapses. Alcohol returned once again in the loneliness of her apartment in Boston. The image of a woman who had once been a symbol of elegance in the Kennedy family was now replaced by front-page news of a woman wandering in a state of disorientation. The tragedy reached its peak in 2004 and 2005. Joan was found unconscious on the streets of Beacon Hill after falling due to heavy intoxication, resulting in a head injury and a broken shoulder. The man who found her at that moment did not even recognize that this was the woman who had once stood beside the President of the United States. As her health continued to decline, her 3 children, Cara, Ted Jr., and Patrick, had to make a difficult decision. They requested the court to appoint a legal guardian for her. Her eldest son, Ted Jr., was appointed guardian in 2004 to manage her financial and medical matters. Her life at this point was heavy with burden. She had to face breast cancer in October 2005 and undergo surgery. Although storms continued to come, the final years of Joan Kennedy's life passed in a quiet and unusual stillness. She lived privately in her Boston apartment, staying away from media attention and spending time with her children and grandchildren. In 2009, when her former husband Ted Kennedy passed away from brain cancer, Joan appeared at his funeral in Boston. At that time, she was smaller, her hair completely white, but she still carried the dignity of a woman who had lived through every shade of glory and bitterness. But sorrow returned in 2011 when her eldest daughter, Cara, died suddenly of a heart attack after having overcome lung cancer. Joan endured this loss in silence and with the resilience of a mother who had grown accustomed to burying loved ones. In the following years, she gradually lost her memory due to dementia. But she no longer had to struggle with alcohol. Her alcoholism was recorded as having completely subsided in the final years of her life. Joan Kennedy passed away peacefully in her sleep at home on October 8, 2025, at the age of 89. Her funeral was held at St. Anthony's Shrine in Boston, where family and old friends gathered to say goodbye to the last woman of the Camelot generation. After looking back at this entire story, I think the saddest thing about Joan Kennedy is not the scandals or the years she struggled with alcohol. It is the feeling that she spent too much time living for others. If you look closely from the beginning to the end of the story, Joan was almost always the one who had to fit in. As a child, she was taught to always be gentle, beautiful, and keep her emotions to herself. When she entered the Kennedy family, that expectation became even stronger. She had to become the kind of wife that the family needed. Someone who knew how to smile, knew how to stay silent, and knew how to endure. Even when she was heartbroken by her husband's betrayal, even when she lost a child, even when she herself was falling apart, she still had to appear in front of others as if everything was fine. And I think many people will understand that feeling. There are people in real life who are the same. They go to work, take care of their children, look after their families, try to keep everything stable, until over time, they no longer know what they truly want. That is why the final part of Joan's life makes me think a lot. After the divorce, for the first time, she was able to slow down. She no longer had to chase the image of the Kennedy family. She no longer had to stand behind any political campaign. She returned to the piano. She went back to school. She taught music to children. It sounds very small, doesn't it? But that was the first time Joan truly lived for herself. Not Mrs. Kennedy. Not the woman standing behind a politician. Just Joan. And sometimes, what makes a person happy is not fame or power. It is reaching a moment when they no longer have to try to become the version that others expect. If the story of Joan Kennedy makes you think or touches something in your own life, leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about the deeper side of powerful families like this, do not forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to follow along with the next stories.